Awesome.
Yeah. All right. As promised, folks, I am here with Christopher Hicks, and it is definitely going to be an interesting one. Chris was deep in the music industry as a drummer, toured with Sublime, and there is a point in this story where the temptation, the whispering, the voice from the devil comes, soliciting him to make a pact with the devil. But before we get to that, huge thank you to Chris for coming on. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Now, Chris is going to take us through his journey slowly and chronologically, so we can understand exactly what's happened. While you post your questions in the chat, I will star them and store them, and then once he's finished telling his story, we will put those questions to him. So again, Chris, thanks for coming on. How did all this start for you, my friend?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's just a blessing to be able to give testimony and just to explain all the things that had happened, accumulated to the point of really, my experience with the devil, and then later my experience with God. So I just want to say thank you before I get started.
Yeah, and Chris's links are in the description box below this video, so please support his work. So when you was a kid, did you ever have that conversation, when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut, I'm going to be a policeman, that kind of thing? Did you ever have any goals like that?
I mean, yeah, I guess it was like a normal kind of kid thing. It's like very standard. It seems like a kid wants to be a fireman, or, like especially, guys, they want to be like a fireman. They want to be president of the United States. And, I always definitely had a desire to become a musician. My father was a musician. He worked at KQRS, 92 KQRS in Minneapolis. He worked as a disc jockey. So he was a guitarist. He was a disc jockey. He also did kung fu. So I very, fell into the cadence of my father and what my father was doing, my real father. However, I lived with my mother and my stepfather in the state of Wyoming, and he had gotten into a very, very severe car accident and, left some, I believe, some like kind of brain trauma. And that's when I noticed the change kind of started happening within him. And he was a severe alcoholic. He was drinking all the time. He, at that point, he ended up becoming very, very abusive. I mean, to a very, very bad degree. And funny enough, like I just talked to my real father a couple of days ago, and I was always under the impression that I was court ordered by the state of Wyoming to leave Douglas, Wyoming, and to go move in with my real father. But actually, that wasn't the case. My real dad told me just recently, and I didn't know about this, that he fought for me. So he got a lawyer during Christmas time. He actually found a Jewish man that was, not celebrating Christmas, obviously. So he got him as a lawyer, ended up figuring everything out. And that's when I actually made the transition. I had no idea about that until a couple of days ago after giving my testimony on another program. So, but yeah, the abuse was very, very bad. I lived in perpetual fear when I was living with that stepfather. I was always afraid to go home. I was afraid to do anything wrong. So I remember leaving my bike at my friend's, and I totally forgot to bring my bike home. And I was so scared to tell my stepfather. So I tried to keep it hush, and he ended up finding out. And he made it like a public display of me, like he ended up like using a belt out in the open, like in front of, the whole neighborhood. So it's just like a lot of shame that was attached to this experience. And I always had this thing that I needed to prove myself after that point. Like I was going to prove myself that I'm worthy of people's attention. I'm worthy of people, that I'm not going to be made a mockery, basically, So what had happened is around Christmas time, and my stepfather had went to a work party with my mother, and I'm not sure exactly what had happened when they got back, but I believe that they were fighting, and my mom ended up taking off to, I believe, her work Christmas party. So I was left at home with my stepfather and my two other sisters. And so when this happened, he came into my room. He was very, very drunk, and he starts abusing me, and he starts punching me and doing all these things. And he's saying, why don't you block, and he was like, you know, Kung Fu, you think, you know, Kung Fu, why don't you block yourself? So I'm trying to block, like these punches. And obviously as a young child, I'm not able to block, punches from a grown man, especially, a very, very, he was relatively, bigger guy, but he was also very inebriated. And there was just, he was just laying it on me. It wasn't like any kind of soft punches. There was a couple of times where he actually picked me up and he threw me across the room. And I remember hitting the wall behind me and just sliding down. And I had my eyes closed. So I didn't even know, like when I was flying through the air, I didn't know which direction I was even going. And when I would open my eyes, I was surprised that I was literally on the way on the other side of the room. So I ended up getting the worst beating of my life. That was the worst one that I had in the past. I had a black eye, bloody lip, bruises everywhere. And I remember the next day that my house, my mother's house and stepfather's house was crawling with cops. They're taking photos of me, it was so much shame because I had to take off my shirt and I had, it was Christmas and it just wasn't the Christmas that I thought it was going to be. So I ended up flying over to New Brighton. Well, it was Minneapolis, Minnesota. Went to New Brighton, Minnesota, where my grandmother is. And we were celebrating Christmas. My father had seen me and he was just like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe what had happened. He even told me recently that he asked me who did this, because my memory on the situation was very, very bad. It wasn't that good because I was so young and just, it was a lot of trauma involved. So he had asked me, he's like, who did this to you? And I was like, it was my stepfather. So he took the initiative, and that's when I ended up moving to New Brighton, Minnesota to live with my real father. And at that time, he was playing guitar all the time. He was playing shows. He was doing these, he would take me to his work. And I remember answering the phones at KQRS 92, for like song requests. And I'm like this, about 9 years old at that time, taking song requests for people that are calling in. So, it was cool. Like I went from trauma to one of the most loving men I've ever met in my life. My dad is a great, great man, very talented at the guitar, loves music. He just oozes with talent. So it just I just fell into that, but I still had this shame. I had this desire to be recognized and to prove myself to people. So any normal kid at that time, I'm sure, I believe a lot of kids, they want to play drums, and I always loved drums. The first time I played drums was about 9 years old, right when I moved there, and I was playing my dad's drummer's kit. And I just, played for about 2 hours straight. And I was like, this is what I want to do when I grow up. So that was actually, at that time, that's where it solidified. I wanted to be a drummer. My dad bought me a kit, learned on my own. I didn't really take any classes or anything like that. He taught me the very basic beat at that moment. And I just kind of went to town, would listen to different music. Back then, I don't know even if your viewers have even heard of Sunny Day Real Estate. That was my favorite band when I was around 14, 15 years old. They were like out of the Seattle grunge movement. So I was like trying to, play exactly what that drummer was. Unbelievable, phenomenal drummer. But anyways, ended up becoming relatively good at that age. Joined my first band called Charlie Brown's Cousin. And we were doing local stuff. At that time, we had moved down to Rochester, Minnesota. So we were playing in Rochester, Minnesota. Mainly, that was like my high school years. Felt like I needed to really expand myself, and I couldn't do that living in Rochester. So I ended up moving to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And at that time, my best friend, he had already moved up there. So he had this place that he was hanging out at all the time called the Playhouse. And so, my best friend's going there. I was like, yeah, I'm going to go check it out. And so I went there, ended up becoming the main drummer for the Playhouse. I guess you could say there was a lot of studio musicians that had lived there. There was a band called Wookie Foot that actually lived there before me, and it was at that time called the Wookie Foot House. And after they moved out, then we took over and ended up being the Playhouse. So there was crazy things happening at this place because very, very talented Minneapolis musicians that were there. One of the people that actually came out of that place was a gentleman called Matthew Miller, who later became Matisyahu. So I don't know if anybody has heard of Matisyahu, but he actually came out of the Playhouse originally. He was from New York, I believe White Plains, New York. He moved to the Playhouse, lived there for a little bit, but he was traveling all the time. He's doing all these things, but we actually lost contact of Matthew Miller. And it was a couple years, I would say 2 or 3 years later, he ends up calling this guy, Jojo, who was in the band Wookie Foot, and said, he's like, hey, watch, I believe it was Craig Kilborn. He's like, watch Craig Kilborn. He was like, watch it. And we're like, you don't talk to us for like 2.5 years. You just tell us to, watch this show. He was like, just do it. So we end up watching it. And there he is as a Hasidic Jew, Matisyahu, and he's performing reggae on this show. It was crazy. So I actually ended up playing. This was my former band before John Wayne and the Pain, but I was in this band called Adjoining Separatists, and we actually opened up for Matisyahu at a place called the Caboose in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where Matisyahu actually got signed to Sony Records, and then he really blew up after that point. I mean, it's kind of, you don't see a Hasidic Jew doing reggae, it's just like, I don't know, but he was incredible. And it was around this time that like, this was kind of instilling in me, like religion and God. And I just started kind of questioning things. So at this time I was writing a screenplay, and the screenplay was about one subject, but I kept on recalling this photo that I had seen when I was a child. My dad actually had shown this photo to me, and it was a mutual friend of him and I, and it was actually my kung fu teacher and his kung fu teacher. But his mother went overseas to there was a sighting of the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus in Egypt, and she had taken a photo inside this church. I can't remember. I believe it was a Coptic church. I could be wrong. It might be Catholic. But anyways, there had been a lot of sightings of the Virgin Mary at this church. And so she took a photo of this church. And when she got it developed back in the United States, an apparition of a woman presenting a child. And it was like the most beautiful looking woman I've ever seen. Like, I mean, very just soft, like features. You could tell there's just like a lot of love in her eyes, but she was presenting this child. And I knew immediately, my dad didn't even have to tell me what it was, but I knew that it was Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus. So that picture started coming back to my memory all the time, like just like over and over and over. And I felt like a very huge need and desire to, write a screenplay about a prophet. So I started studying the different religions. And I was going from, one religion, Sikhism, to Buddhism, the Muslim religion, all these things, Christianity. And I was just studying and just kind of trying to see what the differences, what the similarities are, and all these different things. So during this time too, I had around this time, like I started joining another group, and it was called John Wayne and the Pain. John Wayne, phenomenal singer. Like he has an amazing voice. And we started making some traction at that time, and I was making quite a bit of money, actually more money than I was making at a hospital that I worked in, Salida, Colorado. So doing really, really well in the music industry, recording at major studios. One of the studios that I recorded at was Pachyderm Studios, which Nirvana recorded I believe it was their In Utero album. So it was their last album before Kurt Cobain ended up, dying. So anyways, just making a lot of traction in the music scene. I was living the high life, but I had this crazy emptiness inside. And it was an emptiness in the sense of there was a void in my heart. I was at the end of myself, and I was about to, you know, commit the S word basically, and I was gonna just end myself. I was in the playhouse in this huge mansion that we had, full studio, bar. We had a production studio up in the upstairs. We also had a slide that went down from the second floor to the kitchen. I mean, it was a crazy home. All the walls were painted, all trippy, and all these different colors and stuff. So it wasn't a normal mansion, but it was a playhouse. Anything that you would think of, like we just basically partied there all the time and recorded music. So I'm in the room, and I remember just praying, and I was weeping, and there was a full moon cast into the window. Like it was just perfectly aligned right in the middle. And I was just remember thinking, I was like, God, if you exist, you need to show yourself to me. Is it through Buddha? Is it through Muhammad, Mary, Jesus? Who is it? And sure enough, I ended up actually having an experience about, I mean, I don't remember how long exactly it was after that point, but it was, I would say, like a week or two within, that time. But I was in Rochester, Minnesota with my ex-fiance, and we were laying down in her parents' basement. We had slept over at her parents' house. We're laying in front of this fireplace, and I woke up around 3 a.m., 3 a.m.-ish, and I was shaking so like profusely, and I was drenched in sweat. Like there was such a fear that had happened, and whatever had happened in my sleep, there was a dream, and I knew it took place in the desert. That's all I knew, but I knew there was just this fear that was just coming upon my body. I've never experienced anything like that in my life at that point. And I remember I had this like these keys, and for whatever, well, I had like a little flashlight thing on there, and I ended up going to the bathroom. I was shaking so much that I even dropped those on the ground. I come back, and I lay back down, and my fiance, she's sleeping throughout this whole situation. And I'm looking at the fireplace, and there hadn't been a fire for a good 3, 4, 5 hours or something like that. And all of a sudden, a little flame rekindled and popped up, and I felt this peace. It just came upon my body, and it completely calmed my body. I've never felt anything like that. It was a peace that surpasses all understanding, and my body completely got calm. And I was able to go to sleep at that point. But I also knew that there was something greater than me, something that I've never experienced before in my life. And I knew God existed at that point, but I just didn't know who through. So I wake up, and I'm trying to tell, thinking that people are going to understand this, and I'm trying to tell my girlfriend, my ex fiance's parents at that time what had happened, and they're looking at me like, okay, yeah, sure, like this guy's nuts, and they're Christian, but they just don't believe in the supernatural. So they're very just how do I put it, religious Christians. I don't want to say religious because some people get offended by that, but the sense they don't believe that God does miracles. You know what I mean? So I was like, okay. I mean, I knew what I experienced, and I knew it was real. So a few days later, I would say, it was like 3 days later, I was working at a coffee shop, and I had a part-time job at a coffee shop called Passport Coffee, which is no longer there in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm sure your viewers, I don't know, maybe some of them have been to Minneapolis, but Minneapolis has a whole bunch of skyway systems where you can walk inside from one building to the next. And it gets very, very cold in Minnesota. Obviously, it's just horribly cold. So they just, made that like a skyway system so you can walk from one building to another. So it was an open face coffee shop facing out. And this guy walks in, and let me back up real quick, because I'd been crying about a half hour earlier, because this is right when a lot of like natural disasters were starting to pick up, happening on the East Coast, earthquakes, hurricanes, and all these things. And it just, to me, it didn't seem like natural. I don't remember hearing all these natural disasters happening all the time. And I was like, I felt such a compassion for people that had to go through this devastation, and losing their home and losing family members. Like this deep compassion hit me. And then this gentleman walks in front of the coffee shop, he points inside and he said, "There you are. I've been looking for you." And it was this pastor that I hadn't seen for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. But it was back in my Rochester days, which was about an hour and a half from Minneapolis. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was like, you're the perfect person that I need to talk to. His name is Grover. So I told Grover what had happened. And he looked at me and he said, "That was from the Lord Jesus Christ, and you're going to have another experience." Well, sure enough, 7 days after that first experience, I had my full encounter with Jesus. And it was my buddy Sean Shukart and I were in the desert inside this vehicle, and this was a dream. And we're going through the desert, and we're heading towards this black thunderstorm, and it's raining, it's lightning, and we're trying to see what was on the other side of this darkness. We're like, let's see what's on this other side of this darkness. And we're getting stuck in the mud, and we're in this vehicle, and it's just like so frustrating. And out of frustration, I remember like even outside we're trying to get the car like unstuck. And it was just like, why are we doing this? Like, what's the point of this? So we end up turning back around. And when we turn back around, I see thousands of white doves flying in the sky. And I'm like, that is crazy. I've never seen anything like that. And all of a sudden they started taking formation, perfect synchronicity, like boom, 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 boom. And I said, "Sean, we're stopping the car. Something big is happening." So we get out of the car, and they had formed a cross, and it took from one end of the sky all the way to the other. But now it had turned into a cloud. So it was a cross, like a cloud cross that took, it was encompassing the whole sky, but it was simple. It was a plain and simple cross. And now there was another cross present to the left, to the right, that were kind of different shape. I would almost have to say, so that if you're looking up to it, the cross on the left had almost like a Celtic kind of style, I guess you would say. It's hard to explain, but it was different. It wasn't plain and simple. And the one to the right was different, but I couldn't really see it all that well. So I don't know exactly what it looked like, right? So I'm looking up at the middle cross, and all of a sudden, I just felt this love, and I couldn't even take my eyes off of it because it was so much love, and it was just, I had this like perfect peace and this warmth that was encompassing my body, and then I was raptured up into it. I was taken up to it. I ended up merging with the cross, and it felt like millions upon millions of volts of electricity just coursing through my body. And the best way that I can explain it was that my body exploded, but it didn't hurt. Or like millions upon millions of electricity, and it didn't hurt. That's the only way that I could possibly explain this. So, and while I was merged with this cross, I also saw like visions of the guys that actually bound the cross together. And I remember them stretching and pulling the rope to tighten it. And I felt it, like I could feel the tightening of the rope. And I also felt the blood of Jesus pour out onto the cross, and that it had so much power. It was crazy. And instantly I am down at the desert ground, and the cross to my left, if you're looking up at it, the cross to the left, the cross to the right of Jesus starts blinking. The one that's kind of like a Celtic, that style cross was blinking in all these dazzling colors. I mean, beautiful colors. It was just mesmerizing, but it didn't have anything, no love, nothing. And it left me in this trance. It was literally lifeless. And so I get out of this trance, and I see a bird come swooping down towards me. And there were still white doves flying around only the middle cross, but this one came swooping down towards me. And I had all this pride and thought it was like the greatest thing ever, even though I was depressed, right? It's like, I'm depressed. My life is horrible, but I have all this pride at the same time. I don't know how that works, but I guess it does. So anyways, the bird comes swooping down towards me, was the only pigeon. And the voice of God spoke, and he said, "Believe." And when he said believe, it was like an earthquake. It created an earthquake because it had so much power, but it had like, kind of like a waterfall, like the rumbling of a waterfall. It had so much power to it, yet at the same time, gentleness. And it's so hard to explain unless you have actually experienced it. So it was like, believe, but it was just gentle at the same time. And when he said believe, I was unable to stand in the presence of God. I was unable to in the Bible, it says that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. That's what had happened to me, and I had to go down to my knees, and I held up my hands, and the bird that came down, the pigeon, starts attacking my hands, and I'm trying to get away and get away, and instantly I appear in this village in the desert, and I'm talking to my best friend at the time, and I'm like, Drew, I was like, you gotta believe Jesus is real. Jesus is real. And he's like, whatever, Chris. He's like, I don't believe. And he turned his back. And I remember feeling so much pain and hurt that even my best friend wouldn't believe. I wake up drenched in sweat, shaking, and completely transformed at that point. I knew God existed. Depression was gone. All these things, my desires of not necessarily of that lifestyle, because I still wanted to play drums, but I was a changed person, definitely at that point, 100%. And real quick to back up as well, that same best friend that was in the dream at the end of the dream, I was on the stoop of the playhouse one evening, and he was kind of sitting back behind me, and I hear this voice, and it was like a straight audible voice, and it says, I'll give you whatever you want: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, it was like someone's like there in my ear speaking, and I just like kind of looked, like I was like, what? That was crazy. And I even turned back to my best friend Drew, and I said, Drew, I just heard a voice saying, I'll give you whatever you want: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Excuse me. And he said, he just looked at me, and he just shook his head like this. He's like, you want it. And from that moment, like I just knew that there was this like, obviously all these things were happening very like within a very short time frame, very close to each other. Obviously there's a spiritual world, God exists, and I was on the wrong track at that time. I was on a track to destruction, all these things. So, but at the same time, like, okay, I'm going to stay in this band. I'm going to start testifying and witnessing to people, and I'm going to try to live this holy Christian life with all these people that are using hard drugs and you name it. So I tried to do that, and I ended up starting to get, I started getting pulled back into my former ways, and I ended up actually becoming worse than I was before. I started using more. I started just drinking more and just doing a lot of things that very promiscuous lifestyle. I thought that's what life was all about. Forgetting, like, I mean, I didn't completely forget, but I always had that in me that, I'm a Christian now, but I was also buying into what is called hyper grace. It's where you can live whatever, lifestyle that you want, and it's all good, but it wasn't. I was starting to, go back to that same feeling of depression and just being lost, and always having, like, you have an experience like that, and you know that God wants you to change, that that there's good and bad. So there's good actions, there's bad actions, and you're continually still living in these bad actions. And so you have this major conviction in your heart, like, I shouldn't be doing this. Why am I doing this? I shouldn't be doing this. And you're, like, yet, like, you still want to hold on to the world and what the world has to offer. And, you're just trying all these things. It was horrible. It just didn't work out. So, um, it just came to a point where I knew that I just had to be done with all this. I just had to be done. And I was on the bus in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was on the 4 bus. I remember specifically because I was sitting there condemning myself, like, how can I be saved? I've done all these things wrong. I'm falling back, into these ways that obviously knew that I didn't want to be. Like, I had quit all the drugs for a while. I quit, smoking cigarettes. I'd quit all these things. I was really trying to live a righteous lifestyle. And I tried, I still wanted to be in the band, ended up getting pulled back into that situation. So, ended up becoming worse than I originally was. And so I'm on this bus and there's nobody on me on the bus. It was just me and the bus driver who's driving. And so a guy gets on the bus and he sits right next to me. I'm kind of thinking like, dude, there's like a full bus there's so many seats that you could have chose. Like, why did you choose to sit, right next to me? And I'm like, okay, this is kind of odd. And he just looks at me. He's like, hey. I'm like, whoa. And he said it really kind of loud and it felt abrasive to me. And I'm like, look, man, I'm trying to live in my pity here, like my condemnation. I didn't say that out loud. That's what I was thinking. But he said, before my accident, I wouldn't have said anything to you. He said, as a matter of fact, I probably would have been really mean. And I was like, accident. And he just took my hand and he puts it on the back of his head. And he had a soft spot on the back of his head. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And he's like, yeah, my mother-in-law hired someone to kill me. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is getting crazy. And he was like, well, it's probably good because I actually hired someone to kill her first. And I'm like, okay, who the heck am I sitting next to? I'm like, this just didn't seem like a good situation. He said that it was over a drug deal that had gone bad. He had hired someone to kill her. The guy that he hired ended up ratting him out to her. So in return, she hired someone to kill him. He gets shot in the head, falls into a coma. I'm not sure how long it was. I believe it was like several weeks that he was in this coma. But anyways, while he was in the coma, he ends up having an experience where he met Jesus Christ. So he ended up meeting Jesus in this coma. He comes out of this coma, and this horrible, wretched man that he used to be, he was completely changed when he came out. So he looked at me and he said, if I can be saved, anybody can be saved. And I was like, wow. I was like, the Lord sent that guy to testify and witness to me. And he rings the little, there's the wire to ring the little bell for the buses. And he rings the bell. And he's about to get off and he looks at me and he just says, I'll see you in heaven. And I was like, okay, the Lord is completely speaking. So after a little bit, even after that, I was still in the band, but there was a certain event that had happened. And I'm not going to kind of indulge in and share that, but it was a very, very horrible situation involving a guy and a woman that was passed out that our band was staying over at his house. It was horrible. And after that, I was like, what am I doing with my life? Like, this is evil. There's just evil surrounding me. Like, I'm going to be this witness and and I don't mind going into, like these places now and testifying and witnessing to people. Totally cool. But it was evil. It was vile. It was wicked. And I knew from that moment that I needed to quit. So we ended up doing a tour with a gentleman named Bernie Worrell. So Bernie Worrell was in Parliament Funkadelic. He was also the keyboardist for the Talking Heads for a while and just really, really huge bands. Toured with him. I think it was about 4 shows. And we were just kind of talking. And I remember John, the lead singer, just saying like, hey, like, what do you believe? And he was like, he just grabs this cross on his neck. He was like, this is what I believe. And this is what gets me through. And we're talking about a guy that went from smoking, like, I don't even know if I can even say, but
the green or the white?
The white. Yeah. Like, just smoking really bad drugs. Right. To be becoming a believer. And that guy ended up really convincing me without knowing he convinced me that, okay, I'm done with the band. I'm quitting. So, ended up actually quitting that band at that point. Even to back up a little bit, because I forgot the part with Sublime. So, I was also touring with Eric Wilson, the bass player of Sublime. And it was my band, John Wayne and the Pain, with his side project, and it was called Stonewing. And so it was him. There was another guy named Jason, who was the lead singer, who was the brother for the lead singer of Long Beach Dub All Stars. There was another guy named Lou, who was on the bass, who owned 17th Street Records, who has recorded Slightly Stupid and all these really, really huge bands. So I was touring with this band, and I'm getting to know Eric Wilson, becoming actually really good friends with Eric Wilson. And our bass player, ironically, ends up like spraining his hand on the tour, because we used to do like longboarding and stuff like that all the time. So he sprains his hand on the tour, and so Eric Wilson, the bass player for Sublime, actually ends up like filling in for our bass player. So it was just wild. So I was playing Sublime songs with the writer of some of the songs and the bass player. It was amazing. It was kind of surreal at that point. So I experienced a lot of stuff. We were making a lot of headway as far as in the music scene, more of the underground music scene, as opposed to kind of obviously the mainstream. A lot of people haven't heard of John Wayne and the Pain. But if you go to definitely certain areas, Minnesota, a lot of people I've heard of John Wayne and the Pain. Go to California, a lot of people I've heard of John Wayne and the Pain. So it's just like we're big in these different pockets in different states, right? So yeah, so I had experienced all that, all this amazing stuff, met a lot of great people, but I was just like, I knew that I needed to be done. Something that I didn't talk about in the other recent YouTube video that I did. At that point, after quitting John Wayne and the Pain, I decided I wanted to go into acting. And ironically, this guy that I used to do plays with had contacted me and said, hey, he was like, I want you to be in this movie. And I'm like, awesome. He said, okay, come to my apartment in St. Paul, and I'll, we'll do a rehearsal and see if you're a good fit for the part. So ended up going over there, ended up actually getting the part in a movie. And I was like, this is just so weird. And it was the worst movie that was ever made. I mean, I'm telling you, it, like, when I say there's bad movies, this was the worst movie ever made, ever. And I believe it might be still on Amazon, but it's called Into the Void. And it was, I don't know, it was like a space movie, like a sci-fi, horrible. And I played a character called Leech. And I was in the movie, I was a very disturbed gentleman with a horrible temper and all these other things. But anyways, the guy that was filming, that was actually doing the camera work, was named David Crowley. So David Crowley he apparently loved my acting. So he kept on having me do these small like parts in these like short films, music videos, etc. He also wanted me to play a part in a movie that he was developing at that time called Gray State. He was coming up with this concept with another buddy, Danny August Mason. And I go and I hear him out, like, as far as like what the premise of the movie was. And it's about the mark of the beast and, the New World Order and all these other things. And I just remember thinking, I was like, it would be cool to do this, but something just didn't feel right in my spirit about it. So I started telling him about my experience that I had with the Lord, and told him about this. And I'm like, I would rather do something that had a little bit more hope than all this doom and gloom, So I turned the movie down, rejected it. Well, he ended up actually doing a trailer for that movie, ends up going crazy viral. I believe it ended up getting like 2 million views within 2 weeks. And he was also on the Alex Jones show and all these other things. Well, anyways, I think it was like 2 or 3 years passed, and he had done before the 2 or 3 years passed, he had done a Kickstarter, kind of like GoFundMe kind of thing. and raised all this money. He had like this cult following, and all these people donated, but there was never any movie that got made after 2 or 3 years. So they're kind of like wondering, like, hey, what happened to our money? Like we invested in this, and nothing has been done with it. He ended up actually going out to California trying to shop it out and get like a bigger budget. So he had gotten offered $1 million by this company to basically buy all, but they wanted the full rights to the movie. And he didn't want to do that. He was like, this is my baby. This is my concept. Danny August Mason and I don't want to just like give it away. Right. So he tried to, I don't know. I don't know. And I think he might have just spent all the money. Well, it was around Christmas time, and I don't even remember the exact year, but it was 2 weeks after Christmas. There was all these packages building up on his doorstep, and no one was collecting them. And the neighbors were wondering what's going on. Like, why aren't they getting their packages? Like, what's up? So one of the neighbors went to go and just kind of peek through their window just to see if they're okay, and saw David, I believe it was David that they saw dead on the ground. And it was a murder suicide. So he murdered his wife, his child. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And then the S word. But yeah, so it was crazy story, and all of the people that were supporting him thinking it was like a government conspiracy. There's like a lot of conspiracy theorist people like involved in this group, right? So they were like, oh, the government did it, the government, blah, blah, blah. And I just believe that the lack of hope in the movie, honestly, I believe it drove him nuts. And he ended up doing this horrible, horrible thing. So did this horrible thing. And there was a famous director, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but he actually ended up doing a documentary about Gray State in this conspiracy theorist movie. And he did this documentary, ended up going on Netflix, and it just exploded even more. So it was just kind of crazy how God has like led me into these situations. And honestly, I believe for the reason to testify and just share the hope, that there's a lot of people that are depressed and kind of going crazy. We're kind of seeing it escalate a lot lately, that people need hope, that they need something that is based in love. And the only real true thing that I truly believe that is Jesus. Only Jesus can give you this peace and this love. So that was a crazy experience that had happened. Got out of acting. And then I got invited to move to California to start a band with this guy named Phil. I'm trying to like not mention like last names as much as possible, but this guy Phil was the person that a lot of people believed sold the last hit to Bradley Noel from Sublime, the lead singer of Sublime. So a lot of people liked him, but a lot of people didn't like him for that fact. So it just within that inner circle of the Sublime crew, they believe that he kind of was the guy that sold him that last hit. But they still hang out with him. I don't know. Go figure. So this guy's a very, very talented guitarist, but very, very drugged out, not doing good. I shouldn't have moved in with this guy at all. His place was horribly dirty. It just felt like I was moving into one of the worst ghettos ever, even though his mom, ironically, actually owned the whole apartment building. And the place that he hung out in, that I was sleeping in the bedroom, was completely dirty, but he had a place next door that he would sleep in that was completely clean. And I'm just like, okay, this is so odd. But it was just nasty, a really bad situation. I wasn't taking the band seriously that he wanted to start, and he definitely picked up on that, and he kicked me out. He ended up just kicking me out. I ended up contacting my stepfather, out of all people, and he bought me a ticket to go to Wyoming. I ended up moving to Wyoming with my mother. And just to kind of brief people, that my stepfather actually gave up drinking and everything. He ended up becoming one of the best people I know. He became a very devout Christian, just a loving man, an awesome guy. So he was willing to do with, whatever is needed to get me out of that situation. Which is kind of wild too, because I think about like the person that he became and all these things, but he also held on to a lot of shame of what he had done to me. And almost every single time even to this day, that I go to visit my mom or go to see him, he says he's sorry and that, it's like he's had a very tough time forgiving himself. And I just keep on telling him like, look, I've forgiven you, like it's all good. So yeah, moved there and it ended up spending, I think it was like a month or something like that. And I was like, I cannot live at my mom's house too much more. It's, I'm a grown man. I need to have my own place. Just get out of my parents' house. Right. And I'm sure she had her space anyways. So I ended up moving out, moved to Denver, Colorado, joined another band, which was called Skin Your Teeth, reggae, rock kind of style. Still trying to live the same lifestyle. We got offered a show in Salida, Colorado, and we're playing the show. And the guy that was working the door loved us so much. He was like, "Hey man," he's like, "I got a place out in the mountains." He's like, "You guys should move in with me." We're like, "That sounds great." So we just picked up, left Denver, moved. This is my lifestyle. I would just kind of move from one place to another, not having any like I wasn't rooted anywhere. And we move into this place. We ended up finding out that, and there was a huge grow operation, by the way, in this place. Ended up finding out that he didn't actually own the place. It wasn't his. He was watching it for this guy that lived in Philadelphia. And it was kind of like his summer home. And I didn't actually go into this in the other video, but he ended up stealing a lot of the product that this guy was growing and that he was watching. And so the owner of the place is looking for Skin Your Teeth and, this guy. And we're like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy. So we end up moving into another place with this other guy who was an older gentleman. I think he was probably about 50 something at that time. And I'm like 30, around 32 or something like that at this time. And we move in with this place because he wanted to live with a reggae band. So like he was like a party or two. So we move in and spent some time there. Kept on going to this it was meant for like homeless people and not like there's a huge homeless population in Salida, Colorado, but there's definitely some. Ended up going to eat there at lunchtime, and this woman comes over and she's talking to my friend, the lead singer of the band, Wyatt, and his girlfriend, and just looking at them like, the Lord is telling me that like he's calling you back and saying all this like stuff prophetically. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, she's not talking to them, she's talking to me. And I knew at that point this was my opportunity to really solidify my life with Christ. So I ended up actually volunteering at that place and feeding people, and got to know the woman that worked there named Netta, and became really, really good friends with her. Ended up having meeting this traveling evangelist, Stan, that came through, and he was like, he was like, "You play drums?" He's like, "You should come and play at the church. I'm doing revival nights every single night." So I go to this church, really small church called Upper Room in Salida, and these people are like, it's very charismatic. I don't know if you've ever experienced charismatic, but it looks like complete insanity. Like I'm like, okay, these people are either nuts or that they really had an experience with Jesus and that they're on fire, and I realized it was the latter, that they actually really love Jesus. So I started playing drums at this church, solidified my walk with the Lord, went through a lot of inner healing and deliverance at that time, and just started becoming a changed man, started doing mission work, like evangelistic mission work. And another thing that I didn't share in another video was, so the first time that I ever had any experience with the demonic was I was on the phone, and I was living in Salida, Colorado at this time, kind of freshly, really, where I was like, okay, I gave up all the drugs. I gave up, smoking cigarettes and everything, just gave it all up. I was done, and I quit the band. And I was telling I was on the phone with my sister Amanda, her best friend who lived in Wyoming, or lives in Wyoming. And I hadn't spoke to her for a good amount of years. And back in the day, like when I was, I don't know, 17, 18, she used to have a crush on me and blah, blah, blah. So I was just kind of catching up with her. I hadn't spoke to her for a long, long time. So I started telling her, like, I'm a Christian now. This is what had happened, that the Lord came to me. And I just, gave the same testimony that I gave to you. And all of a sudden she was like, do you hear that? There's like a voice answering some of the questions that you're asking. And I'm like, no. And she was like, well, there it was again. And I actually remember hearing something, and I was thinking, like, sometimes when you have a call and something, it gets intercepted, or you know what I mean? Like it gets crossed and you end up hearing some other conversation. So that's what I thought it was. And all of a sudden she starts saying, like, I'm feeling very, very angry. I'm feeling very, very angry. And her voice got like deep, like very deep. And she starts growling. And I'm like, what is going on here? And she was like, I want to stab myself. She was like, I want to stab myself. And I'm like, oh my Lord. And then I started hearing hissing in the background. She's like, my cats are crawling up the wall. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm like, what do I do? So I start praying, and I'm praying. And then every time I would say, in the name of Jesus, she would like snap out of it. She'd be like, why are you yelling at me? And then she would fall back into it. And then she started reciting Bible scripture in a mocking, demonic voice. It was it was crazy. Then my light started flickering off and on, like above. And I'm like, I am completely petrified at this time. It was the craziest thing that I've, not the craziest thing, as far as demonically, the craziest thing I've ever experienced. And I'm like, okay, I'm just praying, and I'm praying and praying. And I'm saying, in the name of Jesus. And I felt the Lord say, call upon the angel Gabriel. So I call upon the angel Gabriel, and the demon is saying, I see him coming through my wall. And then the demon was saying, like, the length of the wings was from one end of the wall all the way to the other. Like, and it was coming in, and said that he's putting his hand on top of her head, and that she felt this warmth coming through her body. And I was like, just receive it, just receive it. And she was like, no. And she hangs up the phone. I didn't touch my phone for the next 3 days. I kid you not. I was so scared. And I had a roommate at this time named Anthony. And it was him and his wife that I was living with. And they had their bedroom. And I just knock on their door. I was like, can I please just sleep on your floor tonight? I was pale white, so scared. And they allowed me to sleep in the room, go in the room. It was like a couple days later where his mom, Suzanne, who's a spiritual mother to me, she's like very, very strong Christian, has gone through things like this quite a bit. So she ends up praying for the spirit of fear to leave me, and it ended up like leaving. But I also remember at that point, I felt different as far as it like coming to like the demonic, that I knew that I had the upper hand on the enemy. And I actually ended up going through like other, deliverances and things like that with demonically possessed people in Uganda, where the demons would actually just get cast out. And the town.
Could you describe that in more detail, Chris?
What the one in Uganda?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So that was pretty wild too. But after having so much fear, and then realizing, like, wait a second, in the name of Jesus, they have to go. They just have to. They have no power whatsoever. So it was our first trip. My buddy Michael, I'll name his last name, Michael Kester, and we went to Uganda. And real quick, because it was a real crazy trip, because there was this guy from the church that kept on coming up to Michael and I and saying, you're not called to Uganda. You're not called to go there, blah, blah, blah. And finally, out of frustration, like, I was just kind of angry. I was like, John, go over there. And then he just, it's like kind of like hissing kind of thing. I'm like, okay, that's kind of weird. And he told us a few days later, he kept on calling us like, hey, I had a dream that your guys' plane crashed. He's like, did you guys have a dream that your guys' plane crashed? And we're like, no, like we know this is from God. We're supposed to do this, and we're not going to listen to you. We're going to go, and we're called to do this. So we're about to get on the plane, and the plane gets well, it was supposed to be like boarding time, like you typically board like what, half hour, 45 minutes before the plane takes off. And they had to take everybody off because the de-icer broke on the plane. And if you don't have the de-icer on the plane, like your plane's going to crash, like straight up, And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I was like, is this guy right? Should I be going on this trip? And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to go no matter what. I'm supposed to go. And it's just like the enemy trying to attack this trip. So we end up, and this was in Washington Dulles Airport, so like around the DC area. So they ended up actually just getting us a hotel, and we ended up flying out the next day. Plane was perfectly fine at that point. Everything was cool. But I just really felt the enemy, the devil, trying to stop what we were supposed to do out there. So we go to this church called Miracle Center in Balopa, Uganda, in the middle of nowhere. A lot of the people, especially the children, had never seen a white person. And a lot of the children were kind of afraid and crying when they saw me because I had, such a pale complexion. And anyways, I had never preached before, done anything like that. I thought it was going to be kind of like door-to-door evangelism, kind of missionary work, whatever. But they had actually set up a crusade. And so there was a church. So there was a church here, and then a catty corner to it, there was a mosque, and there was an open field in between, right? So they had built a stage. They had got all this wood, built it, and it's my turn to preach. And I'm like, okay, I've never done this before. So I just open up the Bible. And honestly, I don't even remember what I preached on because I was kind of nervous. And I just preached whatever was there. A lot of miracles started happening. People were getting healed. There was a point, at one point, there was a woman who was completely blind. She was given her sight back. So a lot of Muslims were starting to give their life to Jesus because they were hearing of all these crazy miracles that were happening. So this was going on at that point, and we were doing door to door. And I remember coming back, and Michael said this woman started running towards him. And he said, in the name of Jesus. And she dropped like a sack of potatoes. She dropped right there, and she starts manifesting. And she's the town crazy person. So she had all this like really just pretty bad, nasty hair, dirt in it all over the place. Her clothes were just horrendous, ripped, like exposing like a lot of stuff. And she's like flopping on the ground. So we're like over her, and we're praying in the name of Jesus. And we're just saying, what will happen in these situations when you pray in the name of Jesus, all these demons will manifest and will try to prevent the person from confessing Jesus is Lord. So that's what will end up happening. So we're like, just say it. Jesus is Lord. Jesus, he wants to heal you and all these things. So she finally got it out and kind of didn't think of any more of that situation. The flopping around kind of stopped and everything. So the next day, I believe it was the next day, I was preaching, and I give an altar call, and all of a sudden these people come up, and that woman was there, but she was completely cleaned up. She had a nice attire, nice clothes, and she was completely right in her head, completely sane. So that even made like more news in that village in Balopa. So more Muslims started like hearing about this, like, wow, there's power in this. So they started giving their life to Christ. Well, after we left, we ended up, leaving Balopa, and the church started growing even more. And there was 2 Muslims that were very, very angry about all these people leaving the mosque and giving their life to Jesus. So they had made this story up of Pastor Steve from Miracle Center, the pastor of the church, that he had a little girl, just like really horrible. I mean, the absolute most horrible thing that you could possibly make up about a person. Anyways, it ended up becoming really big news in Uganda. Radio stations were picking up on it, broadcasting this on the radio, that this pastor Steve had done this to this little girl and all these other things. So I knew in my heart that it just wasn't right. There's no possible way that this guy could have done it. At this point, like, I had started getting a lot of government affiliations, and a lot of people that I knew that were in the government. One woman was the assistant to the President Yoweri Museveni, and she was a really good friend of mine. I was like, hey, can you please help this guy out? Because he had to flee Balopa and he went to Kampala to hide out. So she met up with him. This was one of my next trips that I had gone out, where met with her and, Pastor Steve. And she told me later, she's like, I think he's guilty. So she didn't do anything about it. Well, come to find out what had happened, it was after I returned from that trip, I ended up getting a call from my friend Patrick Namuteza, who was actually from that village. And he told me, he was like, you wouldn't believe what had happened. But there was two guys that made up the story. They were vandalizing the church in the middle of the night, and a cop came and found him vandalizing this church and shot one of them and killed them, like killed this guy. And so there was the one guy left, and he was one of the richest people in Balopa. Some series of events later, he ends up losing all of his money. He became like completely poor, and he felt that God was cursing him for the lie that he told. And he ended up admitting that he lied about this whole situation. So Pastor Steve was able to go back to his church because he never wanted to leave in the first place. He was on the run. His wife still lived there. He had kids that lived there. So he was vindicated. And, the church started dwindling when he was gone, almost to like nothing. And when he came back, and when everybody had heard what actually had happened, the church started growing once again. So he was completely vindicated of that whole situation. But crazy series of events. But you don't mess with God and not expect, like that you lie against a person, all these things, that a person will be vindicated eventually, either within the flesh in this earthly life or the next, So yeah, that was some of the wildest moments, I guess I could say about what had happened.
Chris, how long were you in the music industry for?
Well, that's a good question. So I would say about roughly 15 years. I mean, if you count my high school years, it would be more like 19, 20 years, but it was quite a long time, quite a while.
And how far into that was it when you heard the devil speak to you?
It was around when I was 27 years old. So, if you count like me playing music from when I was 15 up until that time, it was about 12 years later.
All right, so the viewers have just tuned in who didn't hear you earlier then. Before the devil spoke to you, where was your head at that point in your life when you was 27?
Where was my what? I'm sorry.
Where was your head at?
Yeah, I was completely at the end of myself. I was very egotistical, had everything, thought I had everything, in the sense of like, people loved my drumming. People were saying that, oh, you're such an amazing drummer and all this other stuff. And, just kind of eating it up, but inwardly I was a complete mess. I was depressed, and I was literally about to, end myself at that point.
Okay, and just for the people who didn't hear you earlier, where were you when you heard the devil speak to you?
And when that happened, I was on the stoop of this place called the Playhouse. It was a mansion that we had. It was actually, we didn't own it. We rented this mansion out, and it had, I think, like 12 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms. It was huge. We had a full music studio. We had a production studio upstairs where all the hip hop and stuff like that was produced. Obviously, the full music studio was the live instruments. We had a bar, you know, it was practically always stocked. But it was on the stoop of that playhouse, and that's where I heard the voice of the devil, which I know now was the devil, say, "I'll give you whatever you want, sex, drugs, and rock and roll." And it was very clear. It was like someone speaking to me, like right next to my ear, where it was so like startling that I told my best friend who was sitting behind me on that stoop, like, I just heard this voice saying, "I'll give you whatever you want, sex, drugs, and rock and roll." And then he just looks at me, shakes his head, "You know, you want it." And there was something that changed in his eyes. It's almost like something demonically kind of took control of him to be, you know, to like further tempt me into this. So yeah, that was just crazy situation. Oh, and another thing that I didn't um, talk about earlier was also around this time was when this gentleman, I was working part-time at the coffee shop that I kind of had mentioned earlier, where the pastor had came in front and said, you know, "There you are. I've been looking for you. This is the perfect person I needed to talk to." First and foremost, he actually came back and he was interpreting my dream. Like the Lord had shared with him already parts of it. So he was actually like saying parts of my dream before I even told it to him. So he was just receiving these downloads and explaining my dream to me. It was crazy. So something else that had happened while at Passport Coffee, it's not there anymore, but there was a jewelry shop caddy corner, kind of like just off to the right hand from the coffee shop, called Gittleson Jewelers. And these guys that owned it, like, they loved me. So they would always kind of come around and talk to me. And they had this like almost like Italian, "Hey, how you doing, Chris?" You know, like that kind of style. And they just loved like going around and talking to me. And one of his buddies was looking to buy some of the green stuff. So, anyways, I had that hookup. And this was even after I had this experience with Jesus, but I had quit, you know. So I'm like, well, I can hook him up, but you know, I'll quit. So ended up becoming friends with this guy named Rick. Come to find out, this guy was part owner. So he had like a partnership ownership in this company that sold the first circuit boards to the iPhone. I ended up having an iPhone before anybody else had it. I ended up moving in with Rick. I almost want to say his last name, but I shouldn't. Ended up moving in with Rick and his wife, Wendy, and come to find out that his wife was the granddaughter for the Jewish mob, or what is known as the Russian mob, like the actual mob boss. So I'm living with this family. This guy's kind of pretty sketchy. I was doing these like really menial tasks and jobs for him. I would sweep his garage and he'd give me like $700. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, you shouldn't be getting $700 for sweeping a garage, you know, but I was more than happy to accept it. But I also felt like that was like a temptation, because I remember, you know, I would hook him up with the green stuff and he would be smoking and he would just blow it in my face purposely, you know. And I was like, something's not right. He obviously was not a believer in Jesus. He was very new age. He was Jewish, but a very new age kind of Jewish. Believed in multiple gurus and all these other things. And he was telling me how he got the business, and he was working in the basement or the mail room of the basement area. I think it was like Honeywell. I believe it was Honeywell, a large company. Anyways, it might have been 3M too. So he said that he had answered the phone in the mailroom, and he had like not a great job, but how he answered the phone, the guy loved how he corresponded with him and asked him. He was like, "Hey, do you want to become partners in this business?" And that business eventually ended up becoming the company that ended up selling the circuit board for the first iPhone. Before he said that he took that call, it was, I believe, I'm pretty sure he said it was like the day before. If it wasn't the day before, it was like within that week before, that he was praying to the buildings of Minneapolis. He was seeing the skylines of Minneapolis, And he was praying to the building and saying, that's what I want. I want to have everything that has to offer. And I believe that was the moment that he sold his soul. Like
Chris,
completely. Yeah.
when the devil offered you this pact, what was your response?
I knew in my heart that it wasn't right. Like it just felt there was like this sinisterness to it. It just didn't feel. I knew if I were to make that it would happen, but what would come with it, I wasn't sure I was gonna like it. So I always just kind of contemplated that, like, is that worth it? And thank God within that time is when I, it came to the end of myself and ended up praying and asking God, like, who are you and who do I go through? Like, is it through Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus, all these people? And that's when the Lord showed me Jesus.
How did you manage to resist the peer pressure of your friend egging you on, saying, you want it?
Honestly, I didn't even respond to him because I just felt like this is an awfully peculiar situation. It was just something that I've never really experienced up until that point. A lot of the people in the group that I was in, they were into different gurus and all these other things, and they believed in the miraculous kind of stuff, but it was not very authentic, I guess you could say. It wasn't. A lot of that lifestyle was very much about themselves and what can I get out of a situation, even though they would promote and say all these loving things and all these other whatever. It wasn't. It was truly about yourself and how can you advance yourself. So I was just very thrown off by that situation, and I just kind of was taken back. And yeah, that's basically what had happened.
Well, from your vast experience then, do you think that the devil preys upon the music industry? And do you think the activities that revolve around the industry, the abuse of the substances and other activities I won't describe, perhaps open the door for the devil to be invited in?
I 100% believe that is the case, and I always think about, not to say that he did, but I always thought, like, Matisyahu had came out of this place, and he was a gold record winning artist. He had come out of this place. I always thought, like, even though he was Jewish and he was a Hasidic Jew, like very strict, that Hasidism is very strict sect of the Jewish religion, and I'm like thinking, like, did he like sell his soul to get to that point where he's at? I wasn't sure, and I'm not like saying that he did, because I, like, God forbid, but I also do know that he ended up leaving like the Hasidic, lifestyle, and actually became more very new age. After a while, he actually ended up doing a horror movie. I can't remember the movie. It was a very big movie. Can't remember the top of my head. Maybe one of the people in the comment section will comment on that. But he did a movie, and a horror movie, and he was like he was like the guy that did the exorcism and the deliverance, which is kind of, you never see a Jewish person do deliverances in movies, which is kind of ironic. But after that movie, he cut his he had the curls and everything, cut his facial hair, and then he was just completely like a normal guy after that point. It was just very odd how all of that had happened. But I do definitely believe there's people that sell their soul. Like Bradley Noel has a song about, selling his soul. There's many people that talk about it kind of covertly, I guess you could say, about like, oh, something takes over me and I become this different person and I'm able to do these things that I wasn't normally to do. Beyonce is another, one of those people. And I believe it definitely runs rampant in the music industry. Is Lucifer, before he fell, he was the chief musician. He was an angel that was the chief musician and the most beautiful angel. And he wanted to rise and raise himself above God. And that's what cast him down and where he became Satan. So I do believe that, yes, the music industry is targeted, but I also do believe that the film industry is targeted. I believe that people in business, not all people in business, because God can do much more and more abundantly than any man can, or any devil demon can, right? But there's also people that make pacts with the devil that become very successful in business, and I truly 100% believe that happened to Rick. 100%. No doubts in my mind about it. Yeah, I definitely believe in that.
You mentioned Beyonce. What did you hear about Beyonce?
I haven't researched all of that too well. I mean, to a degree, but that there was she gets possessed by, and she even has a name for it. I don't even remember the name off the top of my head, but she says this person or whoever like takes control, and then that's when she becomes the superstar that she is, because she said she wouldn't be able to do it unless that happens. She couldn't do it in her own power, basically. So yeah, there's a lot of stories out there like that. Tons of stories.
And there's a ton of stories come out on Diddy. Do you think he sold his soul?
100%. Yeah. I mean, he's honestly one of the chief ones out there that I believe he led the way for a lot of people. Maybe as a tempter, there to try to pull people in. But you name it, he's done it. I believe murder, all of it, tons of stuff. He's been a part of it. That's just me. I'm not going to say, like, I'm not a lawyer or anything. I'm not a judge, but that's just what my beliefs are. So
Georgie wants to know, how did you rid yourself from the devil once and for all?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I actually didn't go through speak about that all that much. The spirit of lust was on my life heavily for a long time, for a very, very long time, because that was one of the main things that I had really partook in. As far as like the drug aspect, that was a lot easier for me. I remember like I was wake up like in like sweating a lot when my body was trying to rid myself of everything of the drugs. But when I got a deliverance done myself, that's when I really started noticing a difference in my life. But the spirit of lust lasted for a long time. And there's another crazy situation. And this is how the enemy works covertly, even within Christianity. So there was a woman that I had met her online. Don't ever do that. Unless you really believe that it's a true situation. But from Nashville, and was having conversations with her on the phone. I mean, seemed like it was a normal thing, like this, like I might actually really like this woman. I think I'm gonna, she said she was a Christian. Her name was Ruth, and I ended up having a dream. And in the dream, this was right before Donald Trump got elected for his first term. So in the dream, I'm in a grocery store and I'm with this woman, Ruth. But in the dream, she has black hair and she just has a very dark presence. In real life, she has blonde hair. I'm looking at her and I'm like, why does she look so dark? I was like, that's so weird. And I'm like getting groceries and I'm checking the groceries out, and I receive a phone call, and out of all people, it's from Donald Trump. Go figure. And he's very interested in the work that I was doing in Africa. So I'm telling him about the work that I was doing in Africa, and I'm kind of like, why is Donald Trump asking? Why is he concerned with my work that I'm doing in Africa? So I ended up waking up from this dream and I kind of pushed it back and didn't think anything about it. Coming to find out, I ended up falling into sin with her. I went out to Nashville, ended up meeting her, and fell into lustful sin with her, not married. I really truly believe that, that you should be married while committing that act. But anyways, ended up getting a phone call. Well, actually, excuse me, a Facebook message. Well, no. Let me back up real quick because this is very important too. This woman ended up making fake profiles of different Christians saying, I had dreamed a dream about you and Ruth, that you and Ruth were going to get married. And it was all these different people. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I was like, this must be from God, you know? So come to find out later, I got a Facebook message first that they were saying like, hey, I need to talk to you about Ruth. It's very, very important. So they left their phone number. I ended up calling this person, and she ended up telling me, she was like, Ruth is a Satanist, like literally a Satanist, undercover Satanist. And I felt so much shame and hurt. And I was like, you got to be kidding. I was like, I hope this isn't true. But then the Lord reminded me of that dream. And sure enough, she had done this to another gentleman that I ended up actually talking to, another guy. Really bad situation, horrible decision. And that's why I believe and you should be married before making any kind of decision like that, because it's just bad situation. So yeah, that ended up happening. And later I ended up going through a deliverance. I went through a deliverance actually with my new wife, and her and I have been married for almost 5 years now, and got completely all the demonic lust, was taken care of. It left, and I only have eyes for my wife now. So she's talked about a woman of integrity. Like, she is exactly what I needed. And I'm so thankful to God that the Lord brought her into my life. And also too, I wanted to touch on something real quick as well, because I also ended up becoming the executive assistant to one of the biggest pastors in practically in the world. He's actually in Pakistan. He's from Pakistan. He has a part-time home in the United States, but in Pakistan. And through a series of kind of divine appointments and events and dreams and prophetic words and all these other things that had happened to lead to this point of him taking me on as his assistant, he actually led about, I don't even want to put a number to, but it was in the millions. I would say like 8 to 10 million people, led 8 to 10 million people to Jesus in Pakistan. And he did these crusades and these conferences where the largest one was about 1 million people showed up to one of his conferences. Just a sea of people. Most amazing, spectacular thing you could ever see. But yeah, I spent time with him for 4 or 5 years. During COVID is when I ended up actually quitting that ministry, traveled the world, met huge politicians, some top politicians, and you name it. Just the people that I never thought I would meet, ended up meeting Benny Hinn. I'm not going to say much about that because I wasn't a big fan, unfortunately, but I was hoping like a godly man would be a nicer person. But anyways, met him, met a lot of people. And that's just all the glory to Jesus. It's nothing that I could do. It's just like hearing the voice of God and following, and really, like, I believe this was from the Lord. Okay, I'm going to go this way. But the enemy will send these counterfeits for sure. Like, they'll send counterfeits within the church to try to make you to lead you astray. But yeah, kind of wild life.
Brock's asking whether you ever approached to be a Freemason.
I was, but I was kind of thinking like it was like not a real thing, and I think they were just kind of after money. But I had a message on LinkedIn with this gentleman, and the gentleman said that he was, I forgot the name of it, was like Gilderberg Group or something like that, and that he wanted me to join this organization. And he was like, I'll even go there myself to do the initiation. And I was like, no, I definitely don't want that. But that's really the only time that I was ever offered anything like that. A weird thing did happen recently within the past like couple weeks. I had a gentleman hit me up on LinkedIn, and he was like, I really want to, kind of pick your brain, get to know you a little bit more about business and things like that. Cause I've been kind of like delving into business. I tried, which is very difficult, tried to do major oil sales. And this was actually presented to me by a gentleman named Canon Andrew White, who was called the Vicar of Baghdad. But long story short, he actually ended up given the palace of Saddam Hussein, and he put a church inside this palace. And he used his pool as a baptismal, and he used his throne as his pulpit, which is just kind of ironic, talk about taking something bad and making it good, right? So ended up, becoming really good friends with this guy through just all the connections that I ended up gaining, especially with Anwar, yada, yada, yada. But it was all divine appointments with God. So he's like, Chris, I really feel led that you need to become my partner in oil sales. So he was really good friends with the former ambassador of Iraq to Turkey and Kuwait, who lives in Iraq, who was actually originally from England himself, who led a regime to overthrow Saddam Hussein. So now I'm friends with this guy, Emmanuel, who was his friend, the former ambassador, and then Canon Andrew White. And we're trying to do these oil sales. Nothing was working out. So on my LinkedIn profile, I had, kind of like this stuff. My Faith 111 LLC, does oil sales and all these other things. So he was like, I want to pick your brain and just kind of get to know you, the guy that messaged me on LinkedIn. And I'm reading this message. I'm like, okay, I'm going to check this guy out. Kind of looked. And he was the former assistant to President Bush. I'm like, what? I was like, why is this guy hitting me up? It felt really weird. And he has like he has a lot of connections. Like it was the real guy, but I felt there was some kind of ulterior motive for this guy to hit me up. And he also was like something like the director of FEMA. And it was just really like all the connections that he had. I just did not feel right about it. And I believe that was kind of more leaning towards the whole Mason type thing. And I just like, you know what? I'm not going to do it. No way.
Yeah, it sounds like they were trying to co-opt you.
Yeah.
All right. So you've got a question here from Anne. Do you think that there is spiritual warfare through the entire industry?
Oh, 100%. I mean, so the devil wants, people that are going, that have the skills of singing, that have the skills of, playing guitar, acting, you name it, whatever. The devil wants those people to do the bidding. And so when you turn that down, a lot of crazy stuff starts happening where the devil, like you put a bullseye on your back, because you denied and rejected the devil. So yeah, there's tons of spiritual warfare, especially so if you start doing things for the Lord, right? And I play drums in the church now. There's been times where like the sound will just stop working, or you'll just have like a really horrible night, always the night before, and it's just like this constant like spiritual warfare battle that happens because, there's literally a war that is happening in the spirit realm. I mean, between light and darkness, like light cannot be amongst darkness. It's just, they're two opposite things. It just they don't work with each other. One is good, one is bad, So
And Ivy's got a follow-up question on this. So do you sense in your spirit that there is a spiritual shift happening in Hollywood?
Absolutely, I do. And I believe it's, there's going to be the separation of the wheat and the chaff, right? So there's going to be that separation of the good and the bad. And the people that are completely sold out to the devil, they're going to obviously keep on, going in that direction. But God is a merciful God. He wants people saved. He wants to tell people like, hey, he wants, he doesn't want people to be condemned to hell. He doesn't want them to be living this lifestyle. He wants them to have that peace that only he can give them. So he's going to be taking a lot of people out of the industry and having them do work for him. A dream that I had, and I actually posted on my YouTube, but the dream that I had was of a great exposure that was about to happen. And in the dream, I was taking out, I'm just going to give a brief, not the full dream, but in the dream, I was taking out trash and I took it out into this big dumpster and I threw it out. And on the way back, this guy stopped me and he was like, it's happening. The great exposure is happening. The great exposure is happening. And I was like, it is? He was like, yeah, it's in the trash that you were taking out. And I was like, oh man. So I tried to go find the trash, but the garbage man or whatever ended up, they already took it away. And I was on my way back and I see a piece of paper on the ground and I pick it up and it was one piece of paper that fell out of the trash and it had only one name on it. And the name was Barack Obama. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I woke up, I knew there was going to be a great exposure that is going to be happening. And let's just say a great exposure is good in all ways, in my opinion, but it's how the person is going to receive that on the other end. So I believe that there's going to be a great exposure. A lot of people are going to get exposed in Hollywood, the music industry, etc. That some people are going to use that as a time to repent and, change their ways. And the other people are going to use it to keep on going into the bad ways that they're heading in or that they've already headed in. So, yeah.
Bill's wondering who your favorite drummer is.
My favorite drummer? Oh, I guess, honestly, it might not even be a drummer that you guys have heard of, but actually Matisyahu's drummer, Jonah David, was still up there in my favorite just because the style. I love reggae. I love that type of beat. And he's a phenomenal drummer. And, when he came to visit, when we had the Playhouse and they were like jamming out one day, he gave me his drumsticks. And so I was pretty stoked about that at that time. But yeah.
George is asking whether you know Kristen, Faf, or anyone in Janitor Joe.
No, I actually haven't heard of them. Is maybe she could write a follow-up, but was that like a recent group in Minneapolis or?
I've never heard of them either.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. That's interesting.
Next question from viewer is, can you see apparitions when you walk into a room? Can you feel the red flags move you?
I believe one of the greatest gifts that the Lord can give a person is discernment. So to know from good and bad. And that's something that honestly I had to develop over my life because obviously the situation with that woman, Ruth, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so in love, and it ended up just being very detrimental to me. But as far entering places, I have actually entered into places where, okay, you feel like an oppressiveness. There's something wicked that is around that is just obviously it's just not good. Definitely have that. The person that has it in my life is my wife. My wife, she knows when a person has good intentions or not. Like she is on point every single time. So I kind of use her as to, kind of give me more guidance in that sense. But I've been praying for discernment. Definitely is very much needed.
Yeah, and that ties into this question because Sandra's wondering whether you ever feel temptations are put in your path, but now you've got your family and your wife. It just gives you that strength, I imagine.
Yeah, even after deliverance, I had mainly what had happened, and I believe this is like the incubus and the succubus, demons, that I kept on having lustful dreams where they would come to me in the night. And it's always when you're more vulnerable, you're sleeping. And I would have these like temptation dreams in the middle of the night. And that was something that I would always get down on myself. Like I fell into sin in my dreams and I didn't want to. And I always kind of felt like, well, is there still something in my heart, But then there was times later where I would have these dreams where I'd actually start standing up against it in the dream. And so I would like wake up victoriously. But absolutely, there's still definitely the things that had happened where the enemy will try to, send you a stumbling block. And it's so obvious now. Like, mean, to a degree, obviously that whole situation with Ruth was definitely an exception. But even recently, there was this woman in a white car, and she kind of like was riding, on the side of me, like kind of past me. And she just kind of like was looking over, and, she had her shirt kind of down, like right there. And I knew obviously that was just from the enemy. And she was trying to stare at me the whole time. And it's not like she was attracted to me, but it was a demonic thing. It was rooted demonically to try to get me off course, as far as my wife, like try to do something that's going to be horrible against my wife. And it had it written all over it.
Chris, you've been very generous with your time. I'm going to put your YouTube link in the live chat, and Chris's YouTube link and his other links are in the description box below this video. So what have people got forward to look to at your channel if they go over and subscribe?
Well, I hadn't done many videos within, like, I mean, it's been a little bit, I guess you could say, but honestly, I'm going to be picking up a lot more because there's just so many testimonies to tell. And I just want to give people hope, and I want people to understand the spiritual realm, that it is absolutely real. And if there's anybody that I could possibly help out in the future that, to lead them on the right path, I'm more than happy to do that. It's just, I find it a privilege to do God's work. I was doing the enemy's bidding before, not even really realizing it, up until that experience on the stoop. But I was doing the enemy's work at, lust and drugs and like all these other things. And now I'm working for the light of God. I'm doing the work of Jesus Christ. So that's what I want. I'm going to give testimony and show people that I'm not special, that people, they just need to tap into the source. They need to tap into the source of Jesus. And when the Holy Spirit indwells within you, that he gives you power, and that he gives you different giftings and spiritual giftings that can be utilized for the good. So that's really what I want to start teaching people.
Well, you've told your story in a very charismatic and detailed way, and the power that you're plugged into, you radiate light and warmth and positive energy, and we just wish you all the best, and thank you so much for joining us. And like I said to the viewers, go over to Chris's channel. The link is there in the live chat again right now and in the description box. So I'm going to close the show, Chris. I'm going to let you go and spend time with your family. But again, thank you, brother. And you take care. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, God bless, guys. Thank you so much.
Cheers. God bless. Thanks. What a fantastic guest. And if you would like us to get more guests coming on, telling detailed stories like Chris's, put a 1 in the chat, and we will arrange that. And I'm just going to let you guys know what we've got coming up, because we've got a massive day tomorrow. Right. We have got Jay-Z's ex-childhood friend, ex-best friend. Wow. I suspect Shane might be behind this one. 8 p.m. UK. In-depth live stream exploring the intricate dynamics of loyalty and betrayal within the unforgiving world of street life. A rare perspective through the experiences of DeHaven, a childhood friend of Jay-Z. His first-hand account sheds light on the harsh realities that shaped his life and the events that ultimately defined his relationship with one of hip-hop's most iconic figures. Expect candid reflections, untold stories, and an unfiltered look at the consequences of choices made in the streets. That's going to be, fascinating. Then we have got, and this is scheduled for 9:15 p.m., we have got Ronnie Bow live, coming back on after his recent run-in with the law, and he's going to run down in great detail what the hell just happened to him. I did a news report on it earlier, and he gave Jag a heads up saying that the government agencies are watching everything we're doing online with Jag, with Ronnie, what they're doing online themselves. And they leaned on Ronnie and they said, look, if you're saying anything about Jay-Z that we can interpret as criminal, we are going to come at you and put you away again. So, yeah, the club is rallying. All right, guys, it's gone past midnight here. I'm going to go and see Jen and baby Ziggy. They're probably well snoring by now. But thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Chris again. I'm just going to put his link in the live chat one more time. And please go over and support and subscribe to him with what he's doing. All right.